Hi, in this lesson, we'll take a look at else-if statements. As we learned in the last lesson, we can create branching programs in Java by using if-else statements. If-else statements allow us to create alternate paths that execute different commands depending on the outcome of the Boolean expression. While this allows us to add more creativity to our programs, the if-else statement has its limitations. If-else only allows us to compare one condition and choose a path between true and false. But what if there are more than two possible scenarios for a particular condition? In the previous lesson, we created an add tip method that added 25% to the bill if there were 8 or more customers and added 20% if there were less than 8. But what if the restaurant wanted to change its policy to say that if there are less than 4 customers, they aren't charged any additional gratuity? How can we handle this? Else-if statements allow us to incorporate additional conditions to our if-else statements. Else-if statements can be written in the same format as regular if statements, except they include the keyword else before the if statement. Similar to the else statement, the else-if will only test its Boolean expression if the initial if statement evaluates to false. This is the diagram of what an else-if statement looks like when added to the control structure. As we can see, it adds an additional level of complexity. We can think about the else-if as just another if statement that will only execute if the Boolean expression in the else-if evaluates to true and the initial if statement evaluates to false. Let's see what this looks like with our previous example. In our original code, we had an if-else statement that tested if the total customers were greater than or equal to 8. Now, though, we need to add an additional test to see if the total customers is greater than 4 and less than 8. Can you figure out how we might write this? Pause the video and try to solve it yourself. This is what the else-if statement will look like. Let's go through it together. Let's say we created a new bill object called check and called the add tip method to check. The initial call to instantiate the check object assigns the value 100 to cost of meal and 6 to total customers. These are the variables that will be manipulated in this program. The next statement is the add tip method. Once this is called, the program will visit the bill class to execute the add tip method. The add tip method immediately starts with an if statement. The if statement tests if total customers is greater than or equal to 8. Since the value of total customers is 6, the if statement evaluates to false and the code within the if statement does not execute. Add tip then continues to the next statement, which is the else if statement. The condition in the else if is tested and evaluates to true as total customers is greater than 4. Because the else if condition is true, the code in the else if statement will execute and cost of meal will be changed to reflect that. It's very important to understand that the order of the if statement and the else if statement matter a lot in the case of this program. If we switch the order of these two statements, the program will actually create a bug that will mess up the calculation of the tip. If the value of total customers is greater than or equal to 8, the switched if and else if will pose a problem. When we run this program, the initial if statement tests to be true. The cost of meal is then changed in the if statement, and the cost of meal is changed to be 120. But the total customers is 8. Because the else if statement follows the initial if statement, it isn't tested at all if the initial if statement condition is true. Thus, there is a bug in this program that is miscalculating the tip of meals. Paying attention to the order of the if and else if statements matter so that the programs evaluate correctly. Here's a diagram of the program we just created and evaluated. In our program, we also included some additional code that isn't necessary for this program to run. The else statement at the end isn't actually changing anything in the cost of the meal, so we can remove it. We can write this program without the else statement altogether, because else if statements don't run the else statement. They only require an initial if statement to be written. In this particular program, we would only need to include an else statement if less than 4 total customers had an effect on the cost of meal. We could also add another else if statement that will only add to the cost of meal if there are 2 or more people on the bill. There isn't a limit to the number of else-if statements that we can connect to our initial if statement, which allows us to truly customize our programs. It's important to note the differences between the different conditional statements that we can use in our programs. In order to start a conditional statement, we must start it with an if statement. Else if and else are optional additions that can be used to make more complex conditional statements, but they must always start with an if statement. A conditional statement may only have one if and else statement, but can have an unlimited number of else if statements. Adding an if statement to an existing conditional statement would just create an additional conditional statement. Now that you've learned about else if statements, let's get some practice using them in the CodeHS editor.